My name is Daniele Botti. I teach philosophy at Quinnipiac University in Connecticut, and it is my privilege and honor to introduce Professor Geci Karuri-Sebina, as Associate Professor of Digital Governance at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And Professor Karuri-Sebina is going to speak about how foresight and future generations can contribute to structural change. Thank you for accepting our invitation, Professor.
Thank you very much, Daniele, and thanks to the Yale group for inviting me. It's really a privilege. Should we get going then? Okay. So I thought I'd lead in. Okay, sure, perfect. I thought I'd lead in with just a couple of thoughts and maybe not do the whole PowerPoint thing, but rather leave as much time as possible for us to have a conversation. I think that's always quite useful. Then we can respond to what actually interests people. But when this question was raised about how foresight and future generations can contribute to structural change, and I had the opportunity to look at a short concept note about how the concept of structural change is being discussed at this event, I thought what might be interesting to share are two things. One is a framework in thinking about the future that I have spoken to for a little while now, but I always say until you have a new idea that unseats the old one keeps playing back. So for now, I'm still playing this idea back. It still seems somehow useful to me, what I call the three I's. And it's in how we use the future to consider questions of our imagination, how we think about inclusion, and how we think about institutional change. So I'd like to say something briefly about those three I's, the three concepts for the future, and why they matter in the field of foresight, in my view. But then secondly, I think because the conference is trying to look at some practical ideas for what perhaps might advance structural change, I might actually share some of the work we've been doing and encouraging in the African context around civic tech, which is not a new idea, but I thought it would be useful to just table that as what we think is perhaps one of the interesting directions, and maybe just raise the question whether what we sometimes jokingly refer to as DIY is possibly the one of the ideas for structural change. And the reason I present the two is I hope we can look at the two in relation to each other. So on the first part, and why I talk about the three I's, there is an existing field of futures and foresight where people invest quite a lot of time and method and effort in thinking about the future using particular methods and tools, sometimes a little bit carelessly in terms of what epistemologies we use and how we think about the future. One of the papers we actually wrote was about understanding and embedding the idea of the future as a public good, not the future as a private good that just a few people could think about and only think about in particular ways and for particular purpose, but what would it look like to see that more broadly? And one of, as I was asked over the years, what I thought were really important moves to using the future differently in thinking about urban governance, which is one of the fields I'm involved in, or different development fields, I sort of coined these three I's as what I saw as three important pillars, if you want, for futures thinking. The one is imagination, and it sounds silly because the only thing you can do actually with the future is to imagine. The imagination is what we use to engage with the future. But what we were picking up there, and we've got this effort to really look at these ideas of decolonizing imaginaries, is to say that if you're not quite purposeful about understanding what imagination does, and how in so many ways imagination is stolen or excluded from conversations about the future, you end up stuck in very particular externalized visions for what is possible. So you begin to have what we call stolen or reproduced or stale futures, where you're not really allowed to think certain things. So when we say that what somebody suggests is ridiculous or is preposterous or is beyond, it's unrealistic, these are words we use that in many ways are about saying you can't think that and you can't think beyond these boundaries. And therefore, the future for you has to be contained in those sort of ways. I guess the proverbial box that we talk about sometimes, you're in the box. And so it sounds like a small one, but we think it's a really big one. They're emerging anticipatory methods that really try to focus on questions of imagination. How do you expand imagination? How do you allow imagination? A big part of it, of course, is getting people to understand those anticipatory limits and limitations, because it's not a very explicit, it's not a very a tangible thing that happens. It happens to you without you knowing. We go to school and we are taught it. We are surrounded by a world that tells us it. So it's really something very deliberate to call to people's attention the anticipatory system they're using and where imagination itself might be the limitation. Less so an issue in the arts, where people are welcomed to think whatever. Very often in more scientific disciplines, in professional spaces, that's, we now have these carved out spaces of innovation that allow particular kinds of imagination. But the idea that you can literally unimagine, reimagine, and think beyond certain constraints is really not something that comes automatically. The second I is inclusion. So even if you can imagine whatever, too many times I've been in futures conversations where it's really about how we can save the world, right? So the five of us here are going to save the world. I don't know what the world will be doing while we are saving them, but those kinds of conversations are quite popular. I've been in them in Silicon Valley. I've been in them in boardrooms and committee rooms here in South Africa. And there is this idea that inclusion is an end. Inclusion is not the means. Inclusion as the means sounds preposterous. How on earth are you going to include everybody? So of course, what we need then is the few to do for the many. I really have a problem with that embedded logic in a lot of development thinking. I think it's what leads to development as an industry. I think it's what leads to generalizing things and believing that diversity and inclusion is a slogan and not something actually meaningful and necessary. The idea that the few do for the billions is not something I think that is an idea to carry into the future. And I do not believe inclusion is an end if it is not the means. And we have the means in any case. So when people say, well, you can't include everybody, I challenge them to back that up. You can include everybody. And I think that in a way of thinking about the future, a future orientation that isn't fundamentally radically inclusive, I think is problematic. And the last one is institutional change. So that's the big one when you're having a conversation about structural change, because even where people can imagine things being different, and we work with a lot of youth, encouraging them to liberate their minds and decolonize their imaginaries, we can include them and we can use all sorts of methods, infrastructures to be inclusive. But if you keep coming up against the system that has no intention of changing anything actually, and that's most systems, because it's inertia, it's how I guess things perpetuate themselves. It's how certain systems, the systems maybe that we're talking about this week, perpetuate themselves, is exactly through the institutionalization, which sometimes is explicit, sometimes is quite tacit, often it's unspoken rules of the game, but we know that we can't change things once you actually come down to it. And that, I think, is the tricky but really important one to get to. And often my message there is about one, the recognition of that, but two, the effort towards transversality, a genuine transversality, something that says that the hierarchies we are stuck into, hierarchies of power, of control, that continue to posit relations between those who are driving changes and those who they have to convince to do that. Established orders of rulemaking, of lawmaking that are really there to serve an elite and not the majority. And it's very difficult to call that sometimes. Gatekeepers in institutions who are either deliberately that or just, bureaucratically that. And you come up against that. A lot of my work with the public sector and even with other organizations. I'm in a university now, and I find it just as hierarchical and bureaucratic as any other space. And so we have these, ecosystems that we are stuck in, and it's very difficult to do anything differently within those systems because they're vested in not changing anything. Or at least not supporting the change that comes out of imagination and inclusion. So these are the three I's we sort of try to spell out, and they're quite aligned with this idea of the future as a public good that other people can participate in. And based on that, the example I wanted to give just briefly is this idea of civic tech, which, as I say, is not really a new idea, but is an idea that possibly just in the last half decade or so has become quite energetic and is growing quite rapidly. We've gone from when we began tracking civic tech in Africa a few years ago, there were probably dozens of initiatives. There are now hundreds of initiatives that we're tracking and trying to make sense of. They're working across all sorts of different spaces. Many of them, maybe too many of them, in the spaces of sort of democracy and governance, as we call it. So a lot of what I refer to sometimes as watchering, in the Seussian sense, if that's a term. But just watching governments and trying to push for accountability and transparency. But we're also seeing quite a lot in the space of other kinds of engagement, human rights and justice, media work and media freedom work, health work, gender, environment, education. We're seeing a lot of small organizations, big organizations, individuals using tech in a very democratized way to just get on with shit, just to decide that they want to do something and they're not going to wait for some other agency, even if the role is held there, to do it, for them to get going with it. Now, there are challenges with this, and we've tried to do some of that thinking to say that, well, if we're going to say that we're just going to do everything ourselves, which in many ways is beginning to allow the state to abdicate itself of playing certain roles, which in fact we pay tax for and which in fact there are systems in place for, then of course there are real questions about the citizen-state relationship. There are real questions about the legitimacy of the state. There are real questions about the sustainability of what we do. There are questions about how it ought to be funded. Should these be funded as public goods? And it's one of the fights actually that I've had. But there are also ideas that people on a civic level can and want to deepen their engagement in the sense of deliberative democracy, but also of their empowerment to actually just get things done. So civic technologies are enabling people to facilitate those transactions between residents and city services, and to just do certain things that might have been difficult a decade or two ago. So what does it look like for that to be expanded as a model in the ways that we're already seeing naturally happening? As I've already mentioned, what are the funding models for that? Because we can't be paying the state and then looking for philanthropic funding, to do their job as well. And that's kind of what's happening right now. What does it look like for public agencies or the state to actually partner with that, to enable that, to support that? Is that something positive? And what would they need to invest in? And what would that speak to as a role for them? And then what would it look like for governments, if nothing else, to support healthy digital ecosystems that really allow this kind of advancement in democracy and development that is really allowing people to get on and do the things that they can do, particularly in contexts where those systems fail. But even if the systems didn't fail, people may just want to do things in a different way. What does it look like to see yourself as part of that ecosystem? That's one of the ideas, and we've written some articles I'm happy to share. Just beginning to research what's actually happening on the ground, trying to theorize a little bit about it. And I don't know. I think in some ways it might speak to one future direction in terms of how people, and particularly young people in our context, are really beginning to think about contributing to structural change. I think through new imaginaries for sure, in radically more inclusive ways, and we're seeing that, and in ways that are beginning to challenge some of these institutional relationships and structures as they've been. And it'll be interesting to see how those play into the future. So Daniele, I can hand over back to you, but these were my initial thoughts, and I'm really keen to hear what stands out for people or what they'd like to chat further about.
Thank you very much, Geci. And this is inspiring and extremely interesting for me. I usually deal with more abstract ideas, and but there's a lot of connection between what you have presented and what I sometimes deal with in my research, in my studies. And probably the first question that I have in mind is the question about the second I, about inclusion, imagination, inclusion, institutional change. And when you argued that inclusion shouldn't be seen as an end but as a means, and the idea of treating DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion as a brand, is eroding, right, the meaning of inclusion itself. It comes to mind something that Angela Davis said in South Africa one day. It was the anniversary, I want to say, anniversary of Steve Biko. Was either Steve Biko's birth anniversary or death anniversary, one of those. And Angela Davis said that when the language of diversity colonizes the language of justice, you end up having diversely looking people perpetuating the same mechanisms of oppression and exclusion that diversity was meant to overcome. And that is a difficult discussion. That is a very difficult discussion. I live in the United States, and as you probably know, affirmative action has been overturned by Supreme Court, and often the response to the critique that you have just offered is, well, we have to start from somewhere, right? We have to start including yes, differently looking bodies in certain positions in order to have certain mechanisms to be triggered. And that was the point of affirmative action in the American academia, which is under attack now. So my question is, how do we overcome that bifurcation in the discussion? It seems like a chicken and egg kind of discussion. How do we imagine inclusion and diversity as a means and not as an end, not as a brand, in practice, in our professions, in our institutions, in our governments, in our parliaments? How do we do that in practice?
So that's interesting. So, I don't know if I agree that it's a chicken and egg thing at all. I think it's possible for it to be true that representative democracy is important in general, and then in particular when it comes to whether it's racial diversity, gender diversity, sexuality, whatever the case might be. We have, of course, a very generous constitution in our context that we take very seriously, and as many places do and ought to take seriously. And I have absolutely no problem with the idea that the spaces we create ought to represent the societies we're in. I think that makes absolute sense. And it's one of the ways to make sure that the ideas that get carried into these places represent and reflect that demographic or that social picture. Me, that, however, does not address and may not necessarily address, and maybe this is the point of Angela Davis, the power and structural imbalances and inequalities that can still be perpetuated in a system that looks, wonderfully representative. And I believe both things to be true. I have great difficulty in believing that a room full of white men from the North are going to adequately appreciate and represent me. And therefore, I would like to have somebody who looks like me there. But I also am fully of the belief that somebody who looks like me might think like them. So really, that's that. To me, the idea that we need to dismantle systemic barriers and biases that perpetuate inequality is not the same thing as saying we need to have representation. I think both things can be true, and I believe both things to be true.
Thank you. I would open the floor for Q&A if we have some, otherwise I will. Matteo?
Yeah.
Yep. Yes. Hi. Okay.
No, Matteo.
Please. Okay. You mentioned that well, of parties that kind of imagine a future that does not include everybody. Specifically on what you're working on, do you have examples on such, well, on this argument, or how would you describe not including everybody, and how is that institutionalized maybe as well?
So if I understood correctly, you're talking about the point on inclusion and imagination. Is it both?
Like you were mentioning, like you were going from the Silicon Valley, and that actually people you're talking to, they sometimes that if I understood correctly, that you are talking to people that are not thinking about including everybody, or that cannot imagine to include everybody, or that's kind of yes.
Okay. Many examples, unfortunately. I wish I didn't have so many examples. Maybe let me give two. So I mentioned, and maybe it was rude to mention a particular place, but I have been pulled into many, and we've got a lot of really affluent and powerful people in the world who are in the either social enterprise space or the social innovation space and want to do big things. And I've been lucky enough, I suppose, to be included in some of those spaces. Hello? Sorry? Oh, okay.
There was a glitch. Yeah.
Okay. Am I back now? Okay. And in a way, that's the thing I was talking about. And I remember actually being in a room where there was a big banner that actually said something like the target was, the vision was that we would save billions of people. And we being the organization I was sitting in, and I was just wondering, what are the billions of people going to be doing while you're saving them? And it's a very common way of thinking. And actually, it was interesting because I liked reading the concept note from this conference, because I think there's a real crisis, and I've got teenage daughters, and it's very easy to fall into a savior mentality about how, there's so much trouble in the world, and as a young person, your mission is going to be to save the world, right? So we all want to be superheroes, and we're going to go and we're going to do the one amazing thing that's going to save everybody, and we'll save all the starving children and all of the melting icebergs and the disappearing species. It's a lot that we carry. And I think it's a different form of activism the times we're in call for, that aren't about, cowboy, theatrics about saving the world, but are about recognizing that there are many, many people in the world, billions, in fact. So those billions on the banner, we need to think about how to engage them. I'll give you a practical example in our context, and one that I joke about sometimes. We have massive housing issues, given, urbanization in Africa. So many of our cities have really massive informality, so people living in really poor quality informal housing. I think this is true in many parts of the South. It's true in large parts of Asia as well. And so it's not something unusual. But often when we think about housing policy and housing solutions, they often are about professionals often. So whether it's development professionals or architects or planners, in a way sitting, and so that's a form of professional exclusion, right? So we are the practitioners, we are the experts, we know how to do housing. And yet many of us left on our own in the streets wouldn't even have the wherewithal to put together the kind of sophisticated housing solutions that poor people come up with every day because they're in desperate circumstances and have to figure something out, right? And you'd think, therefore, that's a starting point, because surely if there's an expert here, it's the one who's having to solve for the problem, not the one who, studied at Berkeley, but that's not the way we relate. We don't see people as part of solution. And I don't mean the kind of patronizing, tell us what you want kind of participation. We've done that, and that's also silly. But I do think there is a much more engaged mode we need to find that really actively creates the spaces and systems that embrace and value, co-production. And co-production can be another word we throw around quite a lot, but really sees the contributions of people from all backgrounds, all identities, all perspectives, but in particular, those actually engaged with the challenge, being part of solving for it. And so it sounds radical, and I guess that's why I say radical inclusion. And it's not meant at all to discount expertise. So, yes, of course, we should have engineers and we should have planners, and people should perhaps have some technical skills. But I don't think any of that should be used to disempower those who solve for these issues every day. And too much of the practice I see does exactly that.
Thank you. Mihai, you had a question?
Yes. Thank you so much. I mean, I love this space of conversation. I'm involved into trying to to translate democracy and indicators of democracy, to be more specific, into day-to-day actions where people can relate to what democracy, how democracy is measured, right? And I have two questions. One relates to the African continent. I have some projects that I've started that we are running with local partners there, and mainly community centers in small areas, like in rural areas, small towns, and it's like reinventing a library as a community center. And of course, over the years, I've seen all these steps that various communities in Africa made. You know, somehow they did not get through all the pain that happened in Europe, other places. For instance, certain communities got immediately to e-banking. They did not get through the regular banking system, going to the office, etc. And they are doing online payments. It's unbelievable how well it's functioning. And some communities got directly to mobile mobile phones. Not they did not pass through the regular line phones. And with these, there are a lot of things like, for instance, phone, how was it called, journalism, whereby it's this community of people scattered all around a territory, and then they send SMSs to various places, and these are put together and taken by, I don't know, BBC and others. And my question, starting from this, do you think also in terms of civism, using technology and using other elements, somehow such communities can go fast forward and maybe can teach us some things that we didn't know yet, because they don't have to pass through the same things we've passed through, with all the mistakes that we've been doing, and so on. This is the first question. And the second, if we can get in, if you've been looking into the online voting. It's a big discussion about that. Is it should we go there, or that might be a big trap, whereby, you know, people are like, okay, let's vote online because it might be you know, safer, but is it? So it's just like starting a conversation, of course.
Thanks so much for these questions, Mihai. So first of all, I think you raised the important one about leapfrogging, which I think has been an idea, maybe even a hope for some time, that, oh yeah, maybe we can sort of, first of all, you know, have one benefit anyway of so-called underdevelopment, which is to jump to the next generations of technology, because we really didn't have the base infrastructure to do the old stuff. And I think we've certainly seen that in terms of mobile banking and the examples you give. And I think there'll probably be more of that. In recent years, we've seen this interest in frugal innovations, you know, what people do in a world that wasn't frugal for a long time and is beginning to recognize perhaps the need for being that. Is there anything one can learn from societies that by default have had to be frugal and have maybe only ever done that? And that could be in terms of less consumption, or that could be in terms of approaches to innovation. COVID was interesting. One of the papers I worked on demonstrated that in the first year and a half of COVID, WHO found that about 12% of immediately used technological innovations that were used in health space globally actually came from Africa, which was really interesting, because we, according to the data, and you focus on indicators, produce less than 1% of global knowledge, but suddenly we're producing 12% of the applicable technologies. And that was an interesting thing in terms of what we measure scientific knowledge. But then why would it be that this place that can't contribute to knowledge can contribute to usable technology? And it's these points about what are you measuring and what do you consider to be innovative and useful in particular contexts. Are we going to keep on doing that? And do we become the place the rest of the world learns from? I think to me, it's in part a question of whether we believe that. Because I think it's quite possible to have the opportunity to do something different and then to not do it. And I think history is replete with some of those stories. So I'm hopeful, and I think what I'm seeing perhaps with different centers of power, this kind of decentralized approaches where not the market, but where just people are allowed to really exercise agency and do things differently. I do think there's a real possibility from various contexts, not only from Africa, for there to be a lot of learning in a lot of different ways. But I do think that's dependent on, that big last I, the institutional context here, but then also in the rest of the world. So I'm hopeful, and your mouth to God's ears. I hope we do something special and different. But yeah, I don't know the answer to that. But we are seeing innovative and, like I said, frugal uses of technology. We're seeing people hacking things together and just doing what needs to be done. We're seeing people who are doing very contextualized work that doesn't always buy into some of the globalized models and ways of thinking and theories. And that can only be good, in my view, because that's what innovation, I think, ought to be. Online voting is a tricky one. So we've had a number of talks and a number of our researchers, I think, looking at various aspects of this. And a number of African countries, I think, have gone into online voting and e-voting platforms. What's interesting, of course, as you say, is that I suppose if the reason for doing it is efficiency or addressing risks of corruption and all of that, then there are new challenges that the digital space brings up. What I found really interesting, so earlier this year, after one of the African elections, a good friend of mine wrote a fascinating article where he'd been watching in one of Africa's biggest countries, and expecting to see all kinds of, digital fraud and very fancy, sophisticated things, to essentially steal an election. And he said what he found shocking and in a way a bit of a wake-up call is that actually the corruption that was there turned out to be very old school. Actually, he said the most sophisticated technology was Tipex, like literally just like white outing people's votes. And what that reminded me of, including people being clobbered on the streets, is that we could have all sorts of cyber violences on people, but we have the reality of real physical violences and real just like kind of just old school corruption that still happens and can happen in these contexts. So I think there's a vibrant body of research, and in fact, I'd be happy to share some of the links. We've had some really great speakers and people who've actually looked at what different countries are doing in Africa and whether that's good or bad. Obviously, internationally, there's some very encouraging examples of where online voting has been quite effective. I think what this little story I just gave just reminds us of is that there are many other challenges, not just the technological, that go with our voting practices and the forms of democracy we practice. And so I suppose we just have to keep an eye on both, that while we are developing new solutions, we seem to somehow have a lot of old problems as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I see Thomas has a question. Thomas, you're muted.
Yeah, you missed the best part of it already. I wanted to just raise two issues that I think play a role in the mindset of the people that, with my support and sympathy, you are criticizing and opposing. And I think these two things are, one, the needs for organization in order to achieve change, and secondly, the discrepancy in values. Let me explain what I have in mind here. So people say, look, you're completely right about the world that you're envisaging. We want exactly the same world as you do, a world with participation and inclusion, highly democratic, and so on and so forth. But we have to get to that world. And in order to get to that world, we have to organize and mobilize. And here, sort of being overly inclusive and democratic is actually going to be a disadvantage, because we are not going to be able to be effective and efficient in pushing our agenda. It's going to be, the other side is very well organized. And if we are too democratic and let 1,000 flowers bloom and let different people do their own thing, protest in their own ways, mobilize in their own ways, we will dissipate our energies. And so what we need is pretty strong leadership that focuses us on some of the weakest links in the existing system. The second thing that people say is that in many ways, the problem of the poor and those left behind is that they don't have the right values. So I see that in the feminist movement, for example, where a lot of feminists in the US and in the developed West say, we have reached insights into what the relationship between men and women ought to be that are not yet accessible to many women in the developing world. We got it right. They are often still suffering from false consciousness, from adaptive preferences, adaptive belief formation, and so on. And so are inclined to endorse some of the institutions that we more enlightened feminists know are wrong institutions that should be reformed. So, and that's another reason why the West knows best, why progressives in the North should be the ones leading the movement for reform. Again, I hope it's clear. I'm not endorsing these things. I'm just wanting to see what your reactions are to them.
Thank you. I really love, yes, I do see it as a provocation, but I think an important one. So here's the thing, and I don't know if I'm honest that I have evidence that my way would work better. But what I think I believe quite strongly is that I don't think we win this thing by playing their game. And I really believe that. I really have very little appetite or belief that anybody who tells me that, look, we may be excluding now, but we're excluding so that we can include later. I just don't believe that shit anymore. And I've just seen too much, and including the things I've been part of. So I don't even do this to point fingers anywhere else. I think I've been part of many large efforts at big change. That and it's interesting because I think it speaks exactly to your second point, where I think there's an inherent discrepancy in values. I think one can get so caught up in the good you think you're doing that you don't even see the violence you're perpetrating onto people in this good you're doing. And sometimes I feel that it's more, and I'm not. This is not something new, but I've heard it said before, that I think it's more important sometimes to do no harm than to do good. Because these efforts to do good, I think I've really seen them. In fact, the first PhD topic of many that I had many years ago was really to challenge this idea of the development industry, which is completely built upon these ideas that we can organize and mobilize resources and approaches to address critical and important issues, even if the ways in which the means that are used for that are completely at odds with the purpose of which we claim to be doing it. So I don't have much patience for the argument, even though I have no guarantee that doing it my way would even be successful. But I think and I think there are many people in the space who'd prefer to try something different. It seems a better loss to have doing things the right way than an effort at a win, which I haven't seen yet, doing things in ways that are completely not value aligned. The discrepancy in values I find interesting because what I've found interesting in recent years, watching and doing some studies about the space of philanthropy, is to see a lot of the internal debate and contestation that's coming up, not just about the work that the industry does, but actually about what's happening in organizations themselves. It looks like perhaps what might have at one stage seemed to be the high and mighty, what you call these progressive institutions in the North, are critiquing themselves, and they're critiquing themselves from within in terms of organizational structure issues, in terms of their own diversity and inclusion and how people are treated within the organizations. There's a recent book, I think, by, that's also talking about I can't remember the title of it, but it's about the development aid and philanthropy spaces and the side effects and, the unintended consequences, I think is the term that's used if you've seen the book. that often the industry doesn't admit to. And some of those are really horrible external things, and some of them are pretty terrible internal things. And so I'm not sure the moral high horse is there to be ridden anymore. And so whether it's claiming that there's some ideological superiority or whether there's some better capacity to organize or better values here than there, I think that's highly debatable. So I really don't think that high horse exists anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I see Sujata with a question.
Yes, I just wanted to jump. Thank you so much. And I'm coming in at the end of this presentation, but I just wanted to follow up on this conversation, thinking about, and I see our friends from Brazil are here, so I'm thinking now constitutionally, one about the Indian Constitution. And this concern you raised, Thomas, is the same concern that Dr. B.R. Ambedkar raised in India and created a framework there where you have a federal model of constitutionalism, but very unitary at its core, because there was no way at the local level, for him at least, to overcome the caste oppression without that control at the top. But like you say, it's that you lose control of that model at some point. And then what happens is you get too much control on the top. And in fact, it results in, at some later point, constitutional deprivations. So I don't know what the answer is, to try to overcome those kind of that framework of kind of the obstacles you're facing at the local level, particularly for those most oppressed. And I think about the Brazilian Constitution too, because I wonder if you have then kind of social transformation at the heart of the Constitution. And I think we're seeing that in Brazil. So I'm very looking forward to the panel. But I saw it when I was there for a month. You can see the kind of transformation taking place. Would that be helpful? Would starting from a kind of constitutional foundation where we're thinking more carefully about the integration of social and economic rights and civil and political rights, would that in fact help communities and enhance democratic engagement more than maybe anything else we're really talking about?
Thank you so much for that input, Sujata. And I'm actually wishing now that some of the people I have hearty debates with here were here, because so one of them in particular spends a lot of time looking at constitutional issues. And his answer, I'm pretty sure I can speak for him here, would be absolutely not, because with one of the supposedly most progressive constitutions in the world, he thinks it's probably not very useful at all in our context. And he doesn't think that's the starting point for change here. And if it is, it's through dismantling it. So he would probably make that argument a lot better. So I don't know if that's the starting point. And I think what I was saying on the point about institution is that, and maybe now I must be careful because, maybe I don't know, maybe I had a long day, it's evening here. And so maybe on another day, I might be a bit more polite and pleasant about it. But I don't know how much belief I have that the formal and legal systems the singular place from which to instigate the change we need to see. And that's why I was kind of using this provocation about DIY Africa. Is there a level at which we also need to admit that people just need to get on doing things, while those of us who fiddle with law and policies continue to do so for however long it'll take us to figure that out? And maybe that's the point I'm raising, is that I think we've been at it and we've been at it and we've been at it. I'm in a country where we've been at it, maybe not for as long as other places. Really, it's only the last, 30 years. Doesn't sound like a long time, but for people's lifetimes, where people just don't have access to the most basic dignities, it's a super long time. And so maybe that's the question I'm raising. So would a constitutional foundation perhaps be useful? Probably. I just don't believe anymore that it's the only starting point. And I think we have to have a few other things happen. And I think we will see bigger change sooner from more humble places.
No, thank you for that. And I appreciate that answer, yes.
Do we have another 15 minutes for this panel? Or we... No?
Let me just look.
We have one hour, right? 11:45, 12:45.
We have this other one starting at 12:30.
Yeah, that's what
I know Felipe has to leave, so I'm not sure exactly what time. So he's going to start, but
okay.
So it starts at 12:30. The new panel.
So I'm afraid that we have to wrap up on this panel. And I had another question, but I will send it to you via email. And thank you very much, Professor Karuri-Sebina. This was inspiring and very informative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniele, for the invitation, and thanks everybody who was here. All the best with the rest of the conference.